Welcome to the Access Europe meeting for May 2024. And this month, we're very pleased to welcome a new presenter, Adolph Dupré, who is from the United States of America. And his website is listed there. And it's another one of what now has become quite a flurry of class module-based topics. And today he's going to be creating classes based on several tables. If you want more details and to know where to download after the meeting, Adolph's PowerPoint and the database that goes with this talk, you can either go to my website, adults.co.uk, AEU27, because it is the 27th of these meetings, or the official site, AccessUserGroups.org, Europe, event, Access Europe, and then today's date. I am going to stop sharing now. Please, will you take over and introduce yourself properly?
Good evening, fellow programmers. As you know, I'm Adolph Dupré from the USA. Although I have no formal education in programming, I've managed to earn a living doing this for about 40 years now. Over those years, experience has been my teacher, and the internet, along with you who give back to the community, have been my mentors. I'm here today to hopefully show you something that will help you in coding your next project or help you in your current one. That being said, let's get on with the presentation. What I'm doing here is a short PowerPoint presentation explaining what I'm going to show you in the Access example today. And again, Colin will make the PowerPoint and the example Access database available on his website shortly after the presentation. Feel free to download it. And if you have questions after the presentation, please feel free to send me an email with comments or questions. And my contact information is on the PowerPoint presentation right here. What is a class object in Access? A class object is like a UDT, a user-defined type. And I was going to ask for a show of hands, but since everyone turned off their cameras, if you don't know what it is, please put it in the chat. And after a next slide or two, I'll ask Colin to let me know how many people have not seen it yet. Okay? They both allow you to define an encapsulated set of different fields as an object. A class builds upon this encapsulated set of fields, and it allows you to create functions and subroutines specifically to manage that object. For example, you can initialize all the fields within your class, which you can't do in a UDT. You can validate user-entered data before saving it. You can read, write, update, and delete records through functions of your class. You can define read-only and write-only variables, so you can make them public and or private. So if you need variables that you don't want the user to see, you can create those in a class. And you can run code when the object is terminated, do some housekeeping and clean it up. Some more benefits of classes: it places the business logic in a module which can then be compiled. And as you all know, when you compile something, nobody can ever get a copy of it or look at it. The public properties of class are also picked up by IntelliSense, which I will demonstrate. And a class breaks steps into a bite-sized chunk so code is easier to understand. It makes code more transferable to other backends. So if you're using the same table for a lot of different projects, putting them in one class, it's very easy to transfer that class between projects. A class object does support inheritance. It works very well with object-oriented programming, OOP. And if you don't know what that is, again, put it in the chat and I can explain that. And it also works well with a model view controller architecture, which is more web-based, but it fits here also. Let me throw up a slide on that real quick. Here is a graphical presentation of a model view controller. And MVC is an architectural design pattern that organizes an application's logic into distinct layers, each of which carries out a specific set of tasks. So you have your view here, which is your UI that you see on the screen, and it talks to the controller, which is sort of like your business logic. And then the controller then talks with your database in the back end. And then the database then can send information to the view, or the controller can respond back to the view. But it keeps the database and the business logic separate from the UI, which is very important when you're doing websites, but not so much for Access. Okay, back to the slide presentation. So classes manage the business layer of your code, and this is a key component in object-oriented programming. Now that I've given you a 30,000-foot view of the benefits of a class, I'll give you some indications of when to consider using a class. If you're using an array, a dictionary, or a collection, the added functionality of the class may be beneficial. Having a front end that doesn't have a stable connection to the back end, i.e., if your back end is on the internet and you don't have a really good connection, using classes can alleviate some of the frustration of losing a connection. If you're using an unbound form, using a class is a great way of doing it. Another way of doing it would be an ADO record set, which we may in the future do a presentation on. If more than one coder is working on the code, classes tend towards modularity of the code, i.e., one coder can have one part of the code and the other one can work on it. It just keeps everything compartmentalized. If at sometime in the future, you're thinking of sending the back end will be needed to be upgraded, say like you're going from Access to SQL Server, using classes now will make that migration much easier. And if at some point the front end will be written into another language, classes work very well and are highly portable. You still have to recode part of it, but it's a lot easier to recode a class than it is a function. Okay, let's go right into the example. I have here a table that I called persons. Now, I just created this strictly for this presentation here. We have an auto number, first, last, middle name, date of birth, height, weight, and a BMI, body mass indicator. I just threw that in so I had a calculated field in there. A quick review of how I use my naming convention. My key field always starts with an L and ends with an ID. And the name itself is the name of the table without the TBL on it. Strings and text are always preceded with an S. Dates and times are always a D. Integers and singles are I's. Long integers and doubles are L's. C for currency. B for bullion. Things like that. So just kind of you understand it, that's all. In this table, I have approximately 500 different names, which I got off of a fake name database. So just threw them in there, made up a date of birth and made up a height and weight within ranges just so I had data to play with. Let's go to the class that uses this, and that will be in a module in the back end, okay? And it's all in one module called class person, and there is a slight difference between modules and class modules. Honestly, I don't know what it is, but the Microsoft has designated, classes to have their own type of modules. So they would all be listed here, and regular modules would be up here. In a class, you have to define all your fields as private, which means nobody can see them, and you define what type they are, just like you do in Access. I define my record set so I can hold my data when I get it from a table. Every one of my fields has a let and get statement. Let it be, that means writing to it. Getting means getting it from. And it automatically, you have to have that for every single one of them. Then you have a class initializer. If you have to initialize something when you first create this class, then you can also create default sets for all your private variables. You have an add new flag. You have a delete, which will delete it out of the database and then go to the next record. We have an update if we need to edit it or to add a new one, depending. We have a function defined, and it's optional if you put criteria in. If you don't put criteria, I have it go to the very first one. That's it. I have a next record, which just moves you to the next record. I have a previous record, which moves you to the previous one. Here's where it actually reads the information, read the record from the database. If you ever want to print it in debug mode, you can print the information for the class that you're currently on. And here's a terminate function that will, when you close it, you can put code in here to clean things up. Now, this is approximately 254 lines of code here, and I am going to erase it. Without saving it. Okay, now here is the beauty of it. Okay, this is a regular module whose basis for the code came from various sources on the internet. I'm not taking credit for creating this code solely by myself. I'm just more like modifying it and morphing it together to design it so it would create a class based upon a table. Because I got sick and tired of rewriting it, forgetting about a field when I add, edit, and delete fields. I just did this. Now you need a reference, the Microsoft ActiveX data objects, and I'm sure you all know where that is. And then I define record sets, databases, strings, everything there. Here's the main subroutine that I run. That starts creating the class from a table. And of course, if it's from a table, you do need a table name. And it checks to see if the class is already there. If it does, it just deletes it so it can recreate it. So if you modify it, you do need to save that class before you get rid of it. And I would suggest you rename it before you create a new one. That way you can always bring the modified code over into the new one. And here it reads the table to get all the fields, and then it creates all the private variables. Then it creates the let variables. Then it creates the initialization return subroutines, the default values, the add new, the delete, the update. So it calls each one of these functions, the find, the next record, previous record, read routine, print routine, terminate routine. I did it this way to break it into parts, so you can read any which one you want. Here's what it converts it. So it can name it properly. Delete module. Here's how it actually adds a module in. And here's how it writes to the module, the code you want and the line item. Okay, and here is the declaration on the top. You can put in, you should be putting your name in here when you use this. Creating private variables, the let gets are here. This adds a new one, this deletes one, creates the update subroutine. I don't want to go through all this code because we could get bogged down. Suffice it to say, it's pretty simple and understanding. So now let's use it. Boom, done. That's how quick it is. We just recreated that class person with 254 lines of code. Now, I didn't modify it, so it's an exact duplicate of what it was. And I will always recommend that you save it, Control S. Okay, so that's the class. Now, let's go to where you actually use it. Okay, so here's a form that I used the form wizard on the table person table to generate the fields. And I left them with the names that were in the table that the wizard picked. And there's a good reason to do that, because that way then your class, you don't have to modify any of the names within the class. They'll work right with it. So using your create form wizard, using the person, all the fields, boom, done. Justified, what the heck. We're just going to see what it looks like so you can see it. So all I did this, and I just moved things around and created them, but then I went to data and I just got rid of that. You notice here, before I do this, you notice that these are all bound to the table field. Okay, so now we have buttons, a previous, a next, a new, save, delete, close. We also have a find here. So let's play a little bit with them. Okay. Now there's the very first record. Now, what's nice about this, and let me show you it now, that I can now still go into the table person and I can go to design view because it's not bound. I can make a change here, even though that form is open. Save it off. Go to the new, next. Go previous. And it's still there. I'm going to get rid of it for right now. So each time you click a button, it opens a connection to the table, pulls the record it needs, closes it, and then populates the form. If you need a new one, you can hit that. I did not put debugging software in here. Probably should have at this point. I also have a form where you can search. You only need a partial search, come up with it. And when you hit the end, it'll revert back to the very first one again. Okay, let's look at some of the code behind this. One of the things about an unbound form, the dirty flag does not work. So you do need to create a function or a subroutine that'll set a flag to check if something has changed. And here's what I did here. This reload means reopen the connection to the database or to the table and populate the class with it. So here it is. If the class is nothing, hasn't been created yet or isn't populated, set it here and then find if there is a person ID, find that one and load it, or just start a new one. That's all the reload does. Now, to check if it's updated, I look at the field on the form and I compare it to the class. And if any of them are different, then it's updated. If they're all the same, then it's not updated and I don't have to worry about saving it. Every time you go to current, you change the height or the weight, the BMI gets calculated. Delete, again, you open a connection to the table, load up that one that you want to delete, and then you use your delete function. Once you do that, it moves to the next record, and then it loads the next record into the form. And then here, I close the class. I get rid of the class, which effectively closes the connection to the table. And the new sets default values for it. The next, I just use the move to the next record. Again, open the table and bring that record in, go to the next record, and populate the form fields with that record. Calculate the BMI, and then close out of the class. Now, you don't have to close out of the class each and every time, but I just did that for the demonstration. You can leave it open, but again, if your connection is spotty and it goes down when you're either reading or writing, you're going to get errors, and it can very easily corrupt your database, as I'm sure a lot of you have had happen in the past. Okay, and then saving it, the same thing. Little error checking here. If you don't have a first or a last name, I don't want you saving it. Reloading it, you know what I just saw here? I'm not checking for the last name. Okay, and then you reload it after you save it. Now here you're writing it back from the form over to the class. And then the class then uses the update function to write it from the class back to the table. And then when you do that, if it's a new one, it brings the ID and brings it over into the form. And loading one with a new one. Here's the find function, calculating the BMI, reloading, you saw that, record updated, we went through that. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a second. Colin, is there anything in the chat that people need clarified right now?
Melvin has said, what do you do if your form uses multiple tables? I suppose you'd base it on a query there, wouldn't you, instead?
You could do that. You can base a class on anything, and you can then have the class populate more than one table. I mean, you can pull a class of fields from as many tables as you want, and then you can have the business logic put it into the multiple tables depending on if the data is valid or not. This is a very simplistic use of a class module. Oh, I've used this on prices, the cost equipment for a company. It changes every year. And I have 2 or 3 tables that I have to look at in order to change the price. And I use a class, and within the class, I have functions do all that for me. So it's all in one place, makes it super simple for me to maintain it.
Okay, thank you. Can we come back to Ben's question? Could this be used to build a class object that's later ported to, e.g. Excel, and used with an Excel user form?
Oh, absolutely, to Excel. Excel uses the same VB background. Absolutely.
Okay.
Not that I've done it, but I'm sure it would be. I've used Excel. I've done VB in Excel, and with very minor differences, it's just like programming in Access.
Indeed, it is. Does anyone have any other things they want to raise before Adolph continues?
Just the comment was relevant not to other comments in the chat, but to what Adolph was saying at the time. And he showed a bit of code. If you can find it while I'm talking, brilliant, Adolph. But it was where he'd updated a record and then came back and set the person ID, because it doesn't get, when you have a bound form with an access backend table, as soon as you create a record, as soon as you start working on a record, it will populate the person ID value for you. But with this method, and also with SQL Server linked backends, you don't get that information until the record's been saved. So you would then do an update. Thank you, Adolph. Exactly the right place. You do an update, and then you have to go and find and populate the person ID value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've had that issue before myself too.
Yeah.
This is just one way to do it. Of course, if I was working with a SQL Server backend on this, I'd have to modify this code slightly. But this allows you. Oh, go ahead. Who was going to say something?
Yeah, with that code, you're reading L person ID before it's been updated. Surely when you do an add new, you have to go to the last modified record to get the newly allocated L person ID.
Not if you're using an access table. If you're writing to an access table, it generates that auto ID, your key field, immediately as soon as you put in the first field.
As soon as you dirty it.
Yeah, so I can read that ID once I've started to add the data to the new field.
Does that work in queries in all DAO record sets? I thought the standard practice was that you did the update and then you moved to the last updated record before you read the allocated ID back, because otherwise it doesn't work. If that's not an access table, if that's another backend table, DAO is not going to fill in L person ID until after the update.
Yeah, you would. If I was doing this to a SQL Server, I'd put the code in here. I'd move this down to here, and I'd do last modified record.
Yeah, but the whole point is, if you use DAO, it can sort out what the back end and do all that thinking for you.
Yes.
DAO would have already done that for you, whether it was on Oracle, SQL Server, or Access.
Sorry, I don't believe you're right there, Neil. SQL Server doesn't even create the ID until the update has occurred.
It's exactly what I'm saying. So that after you've done the .update, you move to the last modified record and read it back.
In SQL Server linked tables, yes.
Yes, correct. And in Oracle and in MySQL. So if you did it, and in Access. So if you did that, that code would port across all three platforms untouched.
No, the access, an access linked, do excuse me for jumping in here, everybody. An access linked table or an access local backend, the ID is created at the point of first dirtying of the buffer.
I understand, but it still responds to the .last modified. And the good practice, best practice of using DAO is to use the last modified to go fetch it so that it's platform independent. You've written a piece of access-specific code where if you wrote it to go and get the last modified, will work on all platforms because DAO would sort out the porting for you.
I take your point.
Yes, that's a very valid point, and
it's an unnecessary step, is what you're saying, because Access happens to populate it straight away. The step it may be unnecessary in Access, but it's made the code portable to all platforms.
Portable, yes, quite.
Okay, let me show you one other thing too. Of course, this is very simplistic. We only have 8 fields right here, okay? And if we look at that, now we go back to the form. For all of these, you have to put in, when you're reading and writing to the form, when you're moving to the next, the previous, whatever, you have to do those 8 fields each and every time. That can be a lot of work for you, just what I call boilerplate. So what I do is I come into here, and like my update field has all my fields. So all I do is I copy that. I move to the form, and let's say I needed to put these in the, what are we in here? Let's do move previous. We'll do that one. Put it in. Okay, and now if I take this, Control H, procedure, replace all, and I forgot about this one. Yeah. And then to get rid of the M and turn it into a period, I'm going to capture the equal sign so I don't change this M here and, this M here and all these other M's. And again, search procedure, replace all. 8 again, that's correct. So you'll see that these now are the same as this. So I just got to put the width, the end width, and, this little bit of code up here, which is virtually the same for all the other ones also. So when you have a huge table, you can bring the boilerplate over and modify it very quickly. Add it to your form.
Instead of using a boilerplate and repeating it umpteen times, why don't you just use a subroutine to do it once?
Now, I could probably do that too. Yeah, write it to the form or read it from the form. You only read from the form one time when you're updating, but writing to the form, you do write a lot of times to it. But yeah, you're right. You could do that one time. That would make it a little bit more simpler. Okay, if we have no more questions on that, I want to go to show you this. This is a table for an interview that I wrote a program in for a psychologist who has since passed away. So I have no problem showing it. And as you can see, there are lots of fields in it. So if we now go to the code and I put table interview, and run it, it creates 1,991 lines of code for that interview with all the different let sets, the default, the delete, the find, the previous, the next, the print, the read. I mean, can you imagine having to type all this in? That's the main reason I wrote this. Is it just you know, when you change one field and try and, how do I say it, make sure you change it in every portion of the class, it can get tedious. A lot of times I just replace the whole class. Does anyone else have any questions?
And Neil, if all the get sets are passive, why not use public variables instead?
You don't want people having access to your class variables. You just want them to have access to the functions and the subroutines and the part of the variable that is external to the data. They see if you have a let or a get, this is what they see. They see the S last. They do not see the MS last because they're private. And you may want to do some error checking or validating within a let get before it saves it. You may want to say, is the age between 1 and 110? Or is the weight at least 50 and no more than 500? Or are they no more than 3 foot short and no more than 7 foot tall? So you can put that in your let get statement if you want.
I think what Neil meant by passive in the question was if they didn't do any of that, and your code is an example of it not doing anything but passing it straight on.
This is the way I've always done it, so I can't tell you for sure whether you could bypass the let get statement.
You can. Neil is explaining that you can, but he's right.
Oh, okay.
I can confirm that he's right. You can have public variables in a class.
Oh, absolutely, you can have public variables.
And they are then effectively something that you can let and get without having to have a let and get.
Yep, probably. I've never done it that way. This is the way I was taught, so this is the way I do it.
Absolutely.
But I'm always open to suggestions because, boy, I'm not the brightest apple on the tree.
No, it's not necessarily about being bright, to be fair. You wouldn't necessarily have had all the experience that the rest of us collectively together would have, because that would be difficult for any one person. Don't put yourself down on intelligence. It's just a question of different experiences.
Oh, it is. It's experience, like you said.
Tim Finch has a question.
Thanks very much. Sorry if you can hear my daughter playing the piano in the background. I think possibly in the context, Adolph, perhaps the thing that is relatively new to all of us is the fact you've written a mod which makes the class module and writes all the code. And I suppose the reason you'd want to make the let get is because you might subsequently want to add some verification into those lets and gets, but at the beginning you don't. You know, your mod create class simply does the assigning to the variables. I can totally get why Neil is asking why not make them public, and I suppose one reason would be because in 2 weeks' time, you now want to put in that error checking so that you don't assign someone £30,000 weight or whatever. And now the let and get is already there. So, and if you're creating the lets and gets automatically, why not make them? I suppose would be one argument for putting them in, even if they're not doing anything at the beginning. So that was really just my sort of thought on that.
That's a good point, well made.
Okay, do you want to come back on that, Adolph, or shall I go on to the next person?
And sort of like when we were just discussing getting the key ID out of number field, it's best to do it, cover all instances. You know, you can get away with not doing that if it's an access linked or local, but if you are on SQL or some other database, you do have to save the record before you can view the key ID. So using the lowest common denominator is probably the best, and throwing the let gets in there doesn't hurt, but it can help later on.
Right, Adolph, is anything you haven't covered that you want to cover? I think we've gone through all of the questions.
My final thing is I want to say once again, I want to thank you, Colin, and many more like you who have taken the time to post their code, answer questions, and hosted forums like this in the hopes of helping those of us who are less experienced. I greatly appreciate it, and I'm tickled pink to have the opportunity to give something back today. Thank you all for attending, and I hope I've helped you.
Thanks ever so much, Adolph. Is there any other questions or points people want to raise? There's a lot of things there that will be new to some people, and lots of applause there. Thank you ever so much. You'll get the presentation. More importantly still, you'll get the sample database. You can play with it and adapt it according to your personal needs. I see both methods really of doing it the two different ways that have just been described there, everything all in together, or doing publics to cut down some of the code there. Thank you again on behalf of all these people who are applauding you. Those who didn't make a note of the page references, to download the item, so my website, adults.co.uk, AEU27, and the official site, AccessUserGroups.org, Europe event, Access Europe 2024-0501. Lovely. Thank you again, Adolph. Next month, I'm going to be doing two different topics that should take up about half the time each. The first one is a follow-up to Mike Wolf's presentation back in December, when he showed how to use class modules to deal with the older style import-export specifications that are stored in system tables. He didn't reference at all the newer data task specifications that were introduced in Access 2010 that allow you a wider range of file types to import from or export to, but also obscure all of the details and make it almost impossible to edit them. So what I'm going to show you is how you can edit them, update them, alter them, do what you like with them, and actually make them much more useful than they are now. I know not many people use data task specifications, but they are very powerful. And in the second half, I'm going to be doing an updated version of an extended file properties application that I demonstrated a couple of years ago that allows you to find all of the extended file properties for any individual Windows file, no matter what file type it is, whether or not it can be opened directly from Access. So both of those are me next month, and hopefully you'll find one or both of those to be useful. Yeah, Ben said, using code to generate code is what I appreciate the most about this presentation. I'd have asked to dive into that further if we had more time. My application to analyze and transform JSON files also uses code to generate code. And so I'm very familiar with what Adolph was doing there as well, although I'm not doing that in class modules. But it's amazingly powerful getting code to generate code. It's also getting it right in the first place is the problem there. So, and several other people have said the same with Ben there. Adolph did say that if anyone wanted him to, on a future occasion, he could show a variation on this using record sets. And if other people would be interested in that, perhaps you could indicate that either in the chat or email me, and we can come back to it in a future time. We are currently, we're booked up until January. We've got, I can't remember all the people we've got. I know we've got Ade in December. We've got Philippe Stiefel in January. For those who don't know, courtesy of Ben, who's been nagging me for months, rightly, and I finally going to do what he has asked me to, we've now got an internet calendar file available on either my website or the official one, so you can get a recurring event in Access in Outlook really easily, except that if you do that, please would you immediately change the one for January the 1st next year, Philip Stiefel, because we're moving it back a week so people can sober up before he actually does his session there. So I think most people will be glad that we decide to do that. Yesterday, there was a very interesting and very different session by the Access Lunchtime group. There's been a Discord server set up for live access chat. Now, for most of you that weren't there, that probably means not much at all to you. And at the moment, to be honest, I'm not really clear about the details, though I was there and I watched it and so on, and I've used it. But Ben has given a link. You need to join it, but it's a bit like a live forum. There's lots of subdivisions, but you could use it for discussing code and problems with code. There's all sorts of things that you could do there. But the video for that will be available. Crystal normally does the video for Access Lunchtime, and she will publish that in about 3 weeks' time. But it will be, I think, well worth watching, and it is potentially a great new feature that we may well like to do. It comes from the gaming community, so it's aimed more at, no offense to anyone here, slightly younger people than most of us are, and I certainly include myself in being at the top end of the range. And it has some irritating things like animated avatars and so on, but you can turn those off even if you can't hide them. But on that subject, seriously, although I have got bookings up until the beginning of next year, I'm always open to new presenters, and I would be very pleased to have people that haven't yet done a session for me, or ones that have done a session for me, to actually come up with ideas that we can discuss. Alexandra, I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly, probably not. Do correct me if you would like to turn your microphone on, but I've just seen your question about are old videos available to watch, and the answer is yes. And I've now just posted the playlist, and all 26 of these so far are on there, going back to just over 2 years ago when we started. And this one will be edited and hopefully on the YouTube early next week, and a link will be given at that stage. And if you're a subscriber, and if you aren't, why not? But if you're a subscriber, you'll automatically be notified about that anyway. I am going to love you and leave you and say, I hope to see you all next month for our novice presenter.